Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe so you won't miss the next story that might brighten your day. She was my only daughter. And that Christmas Eve, I found her shivering in the snow, lips blue, her voice so faint it nearly disappeared. "Mom," I wrapped her in my coat, desperate to keep her alive, while inside her husband's family laughed and toasted by the fire. In that moment, holding her fragile body, I swore I would never let her suffer alone again. I never thought Christmas Eve would begin with me kicking down a door, but that's exactly how it happened. One heartbeat, I was out in the snow, clutching my frozen daughter in my arms. The next, I shoved my shoulder against that heavy oak door until it flew open with a crack like thunder. Music stopped mid-song. Laughter choked off. Wine glasses froze in midair. And in that stunned silence, my voice tore through the room, jagged and raw. While you feasted by the fire, my daughter was outside, freezing to death on your porch. Dozens of eyes swung toward me, shock, disgust, confusion. The Langfords looked at me like I had invaded their perfect painting, smudging the gold frame. But I didn't care. All I could feel was the frail weight of Grace in my arms, her body shaking like a bird trapped in a storm. 5 minutes earlier, she had been nothing more than a shadow in the snow. I stepped out of the taxi at the base of the Langfords' marble steps, tugging my scarf tighter against the wind that clawed at my face. My boots sank into unshoveled drifts. Strange, Grace would have salted the walk. She was thoughtful like that, always making sure people were warm, always thinking one step ahead. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I almost mistook it for the creak of ice. A whimper. My head whipped toward the porch swing under the eaves, and there she was, Grace, my only child, slumped in an old wicker chair. Snow piled on her shoulders as if she were nothing more than forgotten furniture. Her blouse clung wet to her skin, far too thin for the 32-degree night. Her bare ankles were red and raw, slippers soaked through. Her hair, usually brushed and shining, was damp, strands plastered to her forehead. Her lips parted when she saw me, and with a voice weaker than I'd ever heard, she whispered the word that cracked my heart open. "Mom." I dropped my bag and lunged to her side. My coat came off in one motion, wrapping around her shoulders. Her skin was ice, her breath shallow. I pressed her face against my chest, trying to share every bit of heat my body still held. "I've got you, baby," I whispered fiercely. I'm here, I'm here." Her eyelids fluttered, her lashes wet with melting snow. "Cold," she breathed. "I know," I said, pulling her closer, tucking her slippers against my shins. "But you're safe now, I won't let go." And then I looked through the wide picture window. Inside, the Langfords' dining room glowed like a magazine spread. A roaring fire in the hearth. A chandelier raining light down onto a long mahogany table draped in crimson. Dishes steaming, roast turkey, cornbread stuffing, jeweled cranberries. Glasses of wine lifted high as laughter rolled like thunder. Victor, her husband, stood tall, charming as ever, refilling his mother's glass. Diana sparkled in emerald silk, pearls at her throat. Charles presided at the head of the table, his face stern even in celebration, as though the entire world were a courtroom. Isabella leaned close to her cousins, laughing at some cruel joke. Not one of them noticed Grace was missing, or worse, they noticed and didn't care. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I gathered Grace in my arms, ignoring the protest in my knees. Step by step, I trudged up the marble stairs, each crunch of snow beneath my boots a drumbeat of war. Her head lolled against my shoulder, lips pale, breath shallow. By the time I reached the door, I wasn't knocking, I was breaking through. The music died the moment the door slammed against the wall. Heads jerked toward us, gasps filled the air. The scent of rosemary and butter rolled over me, sickening in its warmth. Charles Langford rose at once, his voice booming like a gavel. "What is the meaning of this?" I lifted Grace higher, letting them all see her frailty, her damp hair, her lips nearly blue, her shoulders trembling under my coat. "This," I hissed, "is the meaning." Diana's face twisted with annoyance. "Margaret, what on earth?" Her glass tilted lazily in her hand as if she were swatting away a fly. "Grace has her moods. She needed fresh air." "Fresh air," I spat, "in 30 degrees with no shoes." A ripple of discomfort moved around the table. Isabella rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, don't turn this into some tragedy. Grace does this all the time, locks herself in her room, sulks. It pretends she's delicate. We all have problems, she just makes hers up." Laughter flickered again around the table, small and sharp. I held Grace tighter, stroking her damp hair. Her lips moved faintly, forming my name. My fury rose higher than the fire crackling in their hearth. Victor set his glass down with a smirk. "Honestly, Margaret, if it weren't for my parents, I would have kicked her out years ago." The words struck me like a physical blow. Grace flinched weakly, though she was barely conscious. I stepped forward, my boots dripping melted snow onto their polished floor. The silence stretched. They waited for me to collapse, to beg, to scream, but I didn't. Instead, my voice came low, steady, and cutting enough to slice the air. "My daughter was out there in the freezing dark," I said slowly. "While you sat here feasting, laughing, toasting." Diana shifted uncomfortably. Isabella's smirk faltered. Even Victor blinked. I let the truth hang like smoke. I didn't need to shout. Truth carries its own thunder. The chandelier glimmered above us, the fire snapped in the hearth, and still no one spoke. I brushed a strand of wet hair from Grace's face and whispered, "For them as much as for her. I didn't raise my daughter to be anybody's punching bag, and if you won't face your shame tonight." I looked at each of them one by one: Charles, Diana, Isabella, Victor. "Then I'll make sure the world does." The silence was heavy, suffocating, but I didn't waver. Because that night, as I held my trembling daughter against my chest, I swore I would find out the truth, and I would not stay silent. When the firelight flickered across Grace's pale face that night, a floodgate in my memory opened. I couldn't stop myself from drifting backward to a time when my daughter was whole, when life still shimmered with possibility. Grace had always been a child full of dreams. She would press her nose against shop windows during Christmas, her little hand in mine, whispering, "Someday, Mom, I'll have a house full of lights. I'll have babies and they'll never be cold." Never. She wanted nothing grand, not riches, not fame, just a warm family, dinners where laughter came easy, a home where no one ever felt forgotten. Then Victor Langford appeared. He was the kind of man people notice in a room, charming, handsome, polished. He carried himself like the world owed him a bow. The first time I met him, at a small cafe near campus where Grace was finishing her degree, he shook my hand firmly. His smile was practiced but dazzling. "I promise you this," he said, looking me directly in the eye. "I'll take good care of Grace. You'll never have to worry." How I wanted to believe those words. The wedding was everything Grace had dreamed of. White roses spilling over golden arches, violins playing under a cathedral ceiling. Guests whispered about how radiant she looked, glowing in her ivory gown. She leaned against Victor like he was her anchor, her whole face alight with joy. For a moment, even I believed in their fairy tale, but fairy tales are fragile things, and the cracks began sooner than I expected. The first miscarriage came in early spring. I'll never forget the phone call. It was midnight when the ring jolted me awake. Grace's voice was barely recognizable, broken, soaked in tears. "Mom," she whispered, "I lost the baby." I drove through the night, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, headlights cutting through darkness thick as grief. When I arrived, she was curled in bed, clutching a sonogram photo so tightly her knuckles blanched. Victor was gone, business trip, Grace said, her eyes hollow. I sat with her all night, stroking her hair, whispering that she wasn't alone, but nothing could erase the image of her trembling in the dark, mourning a future ripped away. The second miscarriage struck 6 months later. This time, Victor was there, but colder than the December wind rattling the windows. "These things happen," he said flatly, scrolling through his phone. "Don't dwell." Grace looked at him, desperate for comfort. He stood, tucked his phone in his pocket, and left the room. By the third loss, the Langfords no longer bothered with pretense. Charles, his voice heavy with authority, declared, "A family name needs heirs. Otherwise, what's the point?" Diana, flawless in her pearls, offered a smile sharp as glass. Maybe if you spent less time sulking and more time taking care of yourself, things would be different. And Isabella, the younger sister, sneered across the table. Honestly, it's pathetic. Every woman manages this. Why can't you? Grace never repeated those words to me outright. She didn't need to. I heard them in her pauses, in the way her voice cracked when she said, "I'll be fine, Mom, I promise." I began to see the Langford mansion differently, not as a home, but as a gilded cage. Chandeliers and garlands couldn't hide the truth. It was a place where appearances mattered more than compassion, where my daughter's grief was treated as a blemish. By the fourth miscarriage, Grace stopped calling immediately. Days passed before I heard from her. When I finally did, her voice was faint. "I didn't want to bother you," she whispered. "You've already done so much." Those words sliced deeper than any insult the Langfords could hurl. My daughter believed her grief was a burden. She thought I wouldn't want to carry it with her. And I, God forgive me, I let the distance grow. I told myself she needed space, that I shouldn't interfere in her marriage. I thought I was respecting her adulthood, but silence became a weapon, and I hadn't seen it soon enough. One autumn, my oldest friend Ruth came over with a pie and found me staring at the silent phone. "You're waiting for her to call," she said gently. "She always does when something's wrong," I replied. Ruth laid her hand on mine. "That's not strength, Margaret, that's drowning, and she's drowning too." I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right. Looking back, I see the Langfords' cruelty clearly. They chipped away at Grace bit by bit, like winter frost seeping into a branch until it finally snaps. And while they mocked her, dismissed her, excluded her, I told myself she would call when she needed me. I didn't realize she was already sinking. I thought I had known pain. Losing my husband young, raising Grace on a teacher's salary, fighting every storm life threw my way. But nothing compared to watching my only child crushed under the weight of people who should have protected her. And that Christmas night, when I carried Grace across the threshold of their glittering house, I realized a terrible truth. I hadn't seen the worst yet. The Langfords' dining room looked like a painting ripped from a magazine, firelight glowing. Crystal glasses shimmering, turkey carved with precision, laughter rolling like a well-rehearsed choir. But the moment I burst through the door carrying Grace in my arms, their perfect world cracked like glass under a hammer. Gasps erupted. Forks froze in midair. The chandelier hummed faintly overhead as if it too was waiting for my explanation. Charles Langford, the patriarch, rose from his seat at the head of the table. Even without the black robe of his former courtroom, his presence carried authority. His silver hair gleamed under the chandelier, his jaw set in stone. His voice came down like a gavel. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" I lifted Grace higher in my arms, letting them see her pale lips, her trembling body under my coat. "This," I said, my voice low but carrying, "is the meaning." For a beat, silence blanketed the room. Then Diana, his wife, wrapped in emerald silk, pearls glowing against her throat, leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine as if nothing were wrong. "Margaret," she said smoothly, her lips curling, "you're being dramatic. Grace needed fresh air. She does this often. Don't make a scene." "Fresh air?" I spat. She was freezing to death. Isabella, the younger sister, snorted, tossing her auburn curls. "Oh please, Grace hides in her room, sulks, makes up depression just to get attention. We've all seen it. She's pathetic." Her words cut through me like ice. Grace stirred faintly in my arms, a whimper escaping her lips as if even unconscious she still recognized the venom. And then Victor, my son-in-law, her husband, rose. His suit was sharp, his tie loosened for effect, his glass of wine catching the firelight. He looked straight at me with that smug smile that made my skin crawl. "Honestly, Margaret," he said, his voice casual, mocking, "if it weren't for my parents, I would have kicked her out long ago." Laughter trickled across the table, cruel and hollow. My grip tightened around Grace. Her fragile body pressed against me, her breath shallow against my collarbone. I stroked her damp hair, fighting to keep my fury from exploding into screams. Instead, I stepped forward. My boots dripped melted snow onto their polished hardwood floor, leaving a trail like stains that couldn't be erased. They expected me to break, to beg, to collapse under their collective gaze. But I didn't. My daughter, I said, my words slow and deliberate, was left outside tonight, in nothing but a blouse, while you sat here toasting to family. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Diana's smirk faltered. Charles's jaw twitched. Even Isabella's eyes darted away. But Victor chuckled, leaning against the back of his chair. You always did exaggerate. Grace brings this on herself. I locked eyes with him. My voice dropped lower, steadier. Sharp as steel, not another word. The weight of my tone stunned him into silence. For once, he had no clever retort. Around the table, I noticed a boy, Isabella's son, no more than 10, set down his fork. His wide eyes were fixed on Grace, not with disdain but with something purer, compassion. Even children can see cruelty when adults pretend it doesn't exist. I shifted Grace in my arms, brushing a strand of hair from her face, her skin clammy against my fingers. My voice carried through the room, softer but more dangerous than any shout. I didn't raise my daughter to be anyone's punching bag, I said. If you won't face your shame tonight, I'll make sure the world does. The chandelier's light trembled above us. The fire snapped in the hearth. The Langfords stared at me, some with fury, some with discomfort, but none with humanity. And in that silence, I knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. The Langfords thought they could silence me with glares and smug laughter that night. But I refused to let their cruelty vanish into the snow. So weeks later, I found myself sitting in a courthouse, its marble walls echoing with whispers, its benches packed with strangers eager to see a spectacle. The Langfords had money, power, and an army of lawyers. Grace and I had little more than truth, and a lawyer named Mr. James who still believed justice was possible. But as soon as I stepped into that courtroom, I felt the scales already tipping against us. Grace sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, her hands trembling under mine. She wore a pale blue blouse I had ironed that morning, but it seemed to hang loose on her frame as if she had shrunk inside herself. When the bailiff called the court to order, she flinched like a startled child. Relax your shoulders, sweetheart, I whispered, squeezing her hand. Breathe, I'm right here. Her eyes flicked to me, wide and scared, but she nodded faintly. Across the aisle, Victor sat polished as ever, his hair slicked back, his suit pressed. His smirk was small, but it carried the arrogance of a man who thought he'd already won. Behind him sat Charles, arms crossed like a judge presiding over his own trial. Diana fanned herself lazily with the court program as if this were a theater performance. Isabella leaned forward eagerly, her lips already curling. Waiting for blood, the trial began. Grace took the stand first, her voice trembled, but she spoke. She told them about the miscarriages, the loneliness, the cold December night when she was left outside. Every word was true, every word broke me all over again. But when Victor's lawyer rose, he cut her to pieces with questions sharp as knives. Mrs. Langford, he said smoothly, pacing before her like a predator. Isn't it true you often isolated yourself in your room? I was depressed, Grace stammered. So you admit you refused to participate in household duties? I wasn't able to, she whispered. He turned to the jury with a shrug, his expression smug, pathetic, it seemed to say. Then came their star witness, Mrs. Keene, the former housekeeper, a woman I once trusted. A woman who had once braided Grace's hair and called her dear. When asked to describe Grace, her voice was steady but hollow. She was lazy, she said. She left the chores to me. She exaggerated her sadness to avoid responsibilities. Grace gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Tears slipped down her cheeks, her whole body trembling. I wanted to leap up, to shout, how much did they pay you? But my lawyer's hand pressed down on my arm. Not yet, he whispered. I forced myself to stay seated, my nails digging into the wood of the bench. When it was my turn, I presented what I thought was undeniable, the recording from that Christmas night, their laughter, their cruel words. Charles mocking Grace's miscarriages, Victor bragging he would have thrown her out. The courtroom fell silent as the words played. For one moment I thought we had them cornered. For one moment I thought justice might actually breathe, but the judge leaned back, adjusting his glasses. This recording was obtained without consent. Yes, I admitted, but then it is inadmissible, stricken from the record. The gavel struck, and just like that, the most damning truth was erased. Victor's lawyer smiled like a cat with cream. He leaned back, whispering something into Victor's ear. Victor smirked at me across the aisle as if daring me to fight back. Day after day, the trial dragged on. Witnesses were paraded forward, each one twisting the truth further. Some were paid off, others simply afraid to cross the Langford. Our evidence was dismissed. Our words were drowned in objections. And when the verdict finally came, I already knew it before the judge spoke. This court finds insufficient evidence to recognize claims of domestic abuse. Regarding marital assets, the majority shall remain with Mr. Langford, given his greater financial contributions to the household. The gavel fell, final, absolute. Beside me, Grace broke. She collapsed against my shoulder, sobbing with a rawness that filled the silent courtroom. I stroked her hair, whispering, "I've got you, baby, I've got you," even though my own voice trembled. Victor rose slowly, buttoning his jacket like a man preparing to walk onto a stage. His smirk widened, his eyes locking with mine as if to say, "I win." Diana touched up her lipstick with calm precision. Isabella laughed under her breath. Charles nodded with grim satisfaction, like justice had once again bent to his will. But as I held my shattered daughter in my arms, something inside me solidified. Yes, they had won in this courtroom. They had twisted justice, bought it, silenced it. But this wasn't the end. Not for me, not for Grace, not for the truth. The courthouse echoed long after the verdict was read. Even when we stepped outside into the winter air, I could still hear the gavel striking in my chest. Grace clung to me, her sobs breaking into hiccups as I guided her down the steps. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but all I saw was my daughter's hollow eyes, as if the life had been siphoned out of her. At home, she withdrew into silence. Days passed in shadow. She would sit by the window for hours, staring at the frost crawling across the glass, her hands limp in her lap. At night, I'd hear the floor creak as she paced her room. Sometimes I'd find her sitting in the dark, knees tucked to her chest, her eyes distant. I tried to coax her. "Sweetheart, you need to eat. I'm not hungry. Let's go for a walk, just a short one." "I don't want to." Every answer was a wall, and every wall pushed me further into helplessness. Then one evening, a knock came at the door. When I opened it, I saw him, Andrew Cooper. He stood on the porch in his traffic cop uniform, his hat tucked under one arm, a grocery bag in the other. He looked older than I remembered, broader shoulders, lines carved into his face, but his eyes were the same, honest, steady. "Mrs. Hale," he said, nodding politely. "I don't know if you remember me." I blinked. "Andrew, you sat in my sophomore English class. You wrote that essay about Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men." He smiled faintly. "Best grade I ever got. You told me I wrote like I meant it." I couldn't help but chuckle, though my chest still felt heavy. "You did, and you still do, I hope." He lifted the bag toward me. "I was there that night outside the Langfords. I saw Grace on the porch. I filed a report, but you know how it goes, they have connections." His jaw tightened briefly. I thought maybe I could help another way. Inside the bag were simple things: a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of homemade chicken noodle soup, and a poinsettia wrapped in red foil. Ordinary things, but after weeks of bitterness they felt extraordinary. "Thank you," I said softly. He shifted, his voice quieter. "Tell Grace she's not forgotten, that someone cares." When I carried the bag into Grace's room, she barely looked up from the window. "Someone brought this for you." I said, "Andrew Cooper, remember him? He used to be one of my students." Her gaze flicked briefly to the poinsettia, its red petals glowing against the gloom. She whispered, barely audible, "It's pretty." It was the first thing she had said in days. The next afternoon, Andrew returned. This time he carried a small stack of cookbooks. "I remember Grace liked baking," he said to me in the hallway. "Thought she might enjoy these, even if she just looks at the pictures." I set the books beside her on the coffee table. Hours later, I walked by and caught her tracing a recipe for apple pie with her fingertip. She didn't see me, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Interest. Andrew began visiting more often. Sometimes he brought donuts from the corner bakery. Other times, just a cup of coffee for me and a kind word for Grace. He never pressed, he never pitied. He simply showed up, steady and reliable, like a lighthouse in fog. One evening, I found them sitting at the kitchen table together. A cookbook lay open between them. Grace's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "I don't think I can do this," she said softly. "I don't think I can do anything anymore." Andrew leaned forward, his voice calm. "Grace, that's not true. You've survived more than most people could bear. That's not weakness, that's strength." Her eyes filled with tears. She looked down at the recipe page, her lips trembling. Finally, she whispered, "I might never be able to have children. If that disappoints you, I understand." But for a long moment, Andrew just looked at her. Then he reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. His voice was firm but tender. "Family isn't just about blood," he said. "It's about who shows up when you're hurting. And I'm here, Grace. I'm not going anywhere." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Grace's shoulders shook and then the tears came, but they were different this time, tears of release, not despair. She sobbed into his hand. And for the first time in years, I saw her allow herself to lean on someone. I stood hidden in the hallway, tears spilling down my cheeks, because in that moment I saw it, the faint curve of a smile breaking through her tears. It was small, fragile, but it was real, and that smile told me something bigger was about to change. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. Months bled into years, and slowly, our home began to hum with a rhythm I thought we'd lost forever. Grace started small. She baked again, clumsy at first, burning crusts or oversugaring pies. But Andrew always took the first bite, grinning as though it were a feast made for kings. "Best pie I've ever had," he would declare, even as the crust crumbled in his hands. And Grace would laugh, cheeks flushed pink. That laugh was medicine, and each time it came, the house felt brighter, lighter. Sundays became sacred. The three of us would gather around the table, me with my old stories, Grace with her careful smile, Andrew with his steady presence. It wasn't the family she once dreamed of, perhaps, but it was real, and real was enough. One spring afternoon, I walked into the garden and found them planting seeds together. Grace knelt in the soil, her hair tied back, dirt streaking her cheek. Andrew crouched beside her, handing her a tomato seedling. "I used to think I couldn't keep anything alive," Grace murmured, pressing the seedling into the earth. Andrew looked at her, his eyes warm. "Maybe you just needed the right soil." Their gazes held, and in that moment I saw something bloom between them, something stronger than fear, deeper than pain. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe. But life always circles back. Nearly 5 years after the trial, a letter arrived in a heavy cream envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. Charles Langford, the once mighty judge, the man who had sneered at my daughter's pain as though it were trivial. His words were few but heavy. "I am ill, gravely so. The others have drifted away. If she will come, I would see Grace once more." Grace sat at the kitchen table with the letter clutched in her trembling hands. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why now?" I touched her arm gently. "Because guilt doesn't care about time." Andrew's jaw tightened. "You don't owe him anything," he said firmly. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slowly. "Maybe not. But maybe I owe it to myself, to face him not as the girl he broke, but as the woman I've become." So we went. The Langford estate no longer glowed with life. Dust coated the banisters. Curtains hung heavy, stale with neglect. The house that once roared with arrogance now whispered with emptiness. Charles lay in a massive bed in a cavernous room. His body was shrunken, his skin pale and sagging. His eyes, once sharp enough to silence a courtroom, flickered with fear when they landed on Grace. "I didn't think you'd come," he rasped. "I almost didn't," Grace admitted, her voice steady. A long silence stretched, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock. Finally, Charles's lips trembled. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I can't change it, but I was wrong." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she didn't crumble. She stood taller than I had ever seen her, her shoulders squared, her voice clear. "I know," she said, then after a pause she added softly, "and I forgive you, not for you, for me." His eyes closed, a single tear slipping down his cheek. For the first time in his long, powerful life, Charles Langford understood the cost of cruelty. We left without fanfare, stepping into the crisp winter air. Snowflakes drifted softly around us, settling on Grace's shoulders. She tilted her head back, breathing deeply as though exhaling a burden she had carried for far too long. On the drive home, Andrew reached across the seat and took her hand. "You're free now," he said quietly. Grace smiled at him, her eyes glistening, her voice steady. "Yes, I am." That night I sat by the fire, watching the two of them on the couch. Grace leaned against Andrew's shoulder, her laughter light, her eyes bright again. For the first time I realized I no longer needed to hold her up. She had found her own strength and someone to stand beside her. And I thought to myself, justice in the courtroom can be bought, twisted, silenced. But justice of the heart, love, kindness, integrity, that can never be stolen. Grace had healed. I had fulfilled the promise I made on that frozen Christmas night. And Andrew, once a boy scribbling essays in my classroom, had discovered love in the ashes of another man's cruelty. I looked at them, my family, not perfect, not traditional, but ours. Real, and I whispered the words that would stay with me forever. In the end, the Langfords had money, but we had something far greater, the courage to love without conditions. And that, I realized, was the truest victory of all. And most importantly, I kept myself, my truth. Did this story touch your heart? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. If you want more emotional, life-changing stories, don't forget to subscribe to Loving Truth Stories. Your support means the world and helps me bring you even more. 2 more stories are waiting on your screen. Choose one and let's keep walking this journey together. With love and respect always.